You are listening to TBR Radio Presents The DIXIE Heritage Show, with your host, the Director of DIXIE Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
I'm talking again this week with TBR's Executive Editor, Paul Angel, and we're going to talk about this whole thing that's going on across the country right now to defund the police. And, you know, there's just a lot of breakdown, if you will, of what we'll call our societal structure that's going on right now. And so Paul's going to address that and, you know, the monuments that are coming down and just a lot of other things that are going on right now. And we begin the conversation kind of where we left off last week. If you remember, at the end of last week's broadcast, Paul had said that this upcoming election in November is not Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, but it's really Western civilization, polite society, the continuation of America as it has been, or complete lawlessness, complete anarchy, the complete destruction of the social order, and so forth.
If Biden wins, we don't know what's going to happen. It could be that he's declared non-compos mentis right after a couple years or less, and his vice president takes over. So who he picks as vice president is very important. I imagine he's going to pick a black woman. I'm not sure. And then, of course, if Trump wins, there's going to be riots in the streets because for some reason they have convinced everybody that Donald Trump, I wouldn't say everybody, because you got to remember that what we're listening to is the fringe. This is the fringe left. What worries you, though, is that the fringe is being accepted, and an example being Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats getting down on their hands and knees and having help to get back up, because after 8 minutes on the ground, they looked like they were asphyxiated. And wearing African garb, which they know nothing about. It's the classic idiotic liberal pandering for votes. I mean, how bad do they want power? Do they want this nation destroyed just so they can have power? We've already tried their policies in major U.S. cities, and they have failed. And I'm not so sure that Republicans or the conservatives could do anything either. But as I say, it's not something we might be able as white people to solve. We have to get involved and let black people solve their own problems. Listen to them and stop getting on your hands and knees. As one man said, the only person I'm getting down on my knees for is God. I'm certainly not getting down on my hands and knees in the halls of Congress. So how far they take this and how weak white people are going to be, white liberals specifically, and how much they hamstring white people who want to defend themselves. And by the way, there's middle class blacks out there, I imagine, who are worried about this as well. So I'm not so sure that black people aren't going to rise up, and some outlying polls have indicated that as many as 40% of black people in this country are going to vote for Donald Trump. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. I really don't. I just know this is a watershed moment in history, just as it was in the 70s. And you wonder why maybe they wanted to get rid of Richard Nixon. You know, was there more to that than just Watergate in that era to try to get that guy out of office? You know, in retrospect, he was a pretty good president.
You know, I honestly believe that Nixon's crime, if you will, was that he tried to function in his office independently, I guess you could say the swamp. And I wonder if, you know, to some degree, if Trump's crime isn't the same one, the only difference being was that the swamp is more embedded, it's deeper, its tentacles, if you will, stretch out in a lot more directions than it probably did in Nixon's time.
You know, Mike Piper, my old colleague, said all the time, if they want to make you an enemy, they'll make you an enemy. It doesn't matter who you are. You think you're immune. You think getting down on your hands and knees and wearing a kente cloth is going to leave you immune from the looting or the rioting or the claims of racism or loss of job, whatever. But I feel like back in the day that maybe I was wrong because I was younger, and maybe I look back at it nostalgically. I felt like the news media just was a little bit more honest. I mean, if you look at what CNN, MSNBC are saying on television, and fortunately and unfortunately, I have to watch all these news programs just to see what everybody's saying. So I watch Fox, and I have to watch Rachel Maddow, and I watch Don Lemon, although sometimes I have to turn them off. They are pushing for race riots. I can't figure out why, except maybe they were just so desperate to be the voice of some segment of society that they have taken this entire fake narrative that whites are out to oppress minorities. But they should really be taken off the air. I hate to say Adolf Hitler, as you mentioned him, he wouldn't have put up with this baloney. I mean, the way they are pushing this is dangerous.
Well, that's one thing that I've wondered about, and I've been asking myself this question for the last few days now, and that is as bad as it looks. You know, every time I turn around, I'm seeing another news report of another monument being toppled by another angry mob, or I'm seeing another report of another, looting, or I'm seeing another report of, something going on here. And there's part of me that's wondered this, and I was going to ask you this question as well. Is it possible that it's nowhere near as bad as it seems? Because after all, our source for determining the badness is the fake news, and as bad as it is that some monuments have been toppled and that some cities have had riots and so forth, is it possible that it's really not as bad as we think it is? That it's just the media's taking a few isolated incidences and blowing them up and throwing them in our face over and over and over again until we literally think that the whole country is burning when really it's not?
It's possible. I think it's something we definitely have to keep our eyes on. There's a lot of people on the streets, and there's a lot of white people on the streets. So the one thing is, for once, blacks and whites have gotten on the streets for a cause, a social cause, that they agree upon. Unfortunately, I think they're following a fake narrative. Is it that bad? I don't know how many statues have been torn down, but didn't it kind of get you when they pulled down Junipero Serra's statue, when they pulled down George Washington's statue? These are provocative acts that may be designed to push us to some provocative response, so then any white person who would stand up would be then labeled a white supremacist, and then the FBI and the deep state can continue their bogus narrative that the most dangerous terrorists in America are white supremacists. I really don't even know if I know a white supremacist in all my life, okay? But it could be that this is being hyped on both sides. Obviously, if you watch Fox News, you want to slit your wrists afterwards, right? And if you watch CNN and the MSNBC, you want to lock all the doors for fear of mobs are coming. I can tell you that we had the benefit of my generation being lectured by our parents. My father was in World War II and in battle, in multiple battles, wounded, Purple Heart, disabled, able to become a chiropractor, but severely disabled as far as physically and mentally as well. And then my mother, of course, both of them, and my mother and father both lived through depression. So what did they tell us? Don't worry about it. This is nothing. We've lived through worse than this. And whoever becomes president, it's going to be okay. And like I tell people, I think Joe Biden might be senile, but he might end up being the best president in American history if he gets elected. Who knows, right? I just know that right now that the media is playing a game of divide and conquer in a very dangerous way, and they are pushing, especially the left, a fake narrative here about white racism, and it's a dangerous thing because it doesn't make. We've been taught for the past, since 1980, right? I mean, things weren't great in the 60s for blacks here. Let's be honest. I mean, making them drink at separate water fountains, separate lunch counters, and all this stuff. And then the 70s were getting a little better, and then finally in about 80, I guess, the things started to turn around. But for 40 years at least, right, we taught our children to love them, to accept them, to treat them like they deserve, like any human deserves to be treated with respect and dignity and listened to. The same period of time, I think they've been taught to hate us, that we are the problem. Now, listen, this is a small fringe as well. You got to remember there aren't that many Al Sharptons around. They're growing in numbers, and as Sol pointed out in that quote I read, without their narrative of hate, then their entire money-making operation dries up. And so it's the race baiters out there who keep this whole thing alive. It's too bad that this happened now. I don't know whether it would have happened if a black cop had been kneeling on George Floyd's neck, because there was an Asian there, and there was a guy that was obviously a black guy. I mean, he's black when he does something good, when he's half black and half white, but when he does something bad, he's white. You know what I mean? So, but it was the perfect opportunity for them. And now, but the statistics don't bear all this out. I mean, twice the number of whites are killed every year, if not a little more, than blacks are killed. Twice as many unarmed whites are killed than blacks are killed. and it's 10, I think it was, last year. And 5 of them resisted arrest and had a weapon. 2 of them were killed, tragically, I do believe, unarmed blacks. And both of those cops faced murder charges. And a couple other ones were odd situations where they were serving a warrant on somebody and the girlfriend was in the apartment and the boyfriend opened fire on the cops and she get hit. Tragic. And believe me, there are some bad cops out there, but not nearly as many cops as there are bad kids, especially teenagers in the urban city area who have bought into this liturgy of hate, we'll say, and victimization. So I don't know where it's going. We as kids, we weren't that worried about it. I can just tell you my parents were concerned at the time, but they knew that in the end the United States would prevail, law and order would prevail, and society would prevail. I don't know where we're going here, because when you see defunding police departments in larger metropolitan cities, metropolitan areas like Minneapolis and St. Paul, I mean, are the people going to get to vote on this before they put this in place? How do the people in Minneapolis feel? I understand thousands of homes have gone up for sale. Is Minneapolis going to become the murder capital of the world now? I just know that we need liberal, spineless politicians, specifically white ones, have made the matter worse. Look at New York City. Look how demoralized the cops are there. I mean, they do perform an extremely vital service to us.
In your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Yeah, but I know that I've had a friend of mine in Kansas City. He was telling me that a bunch of police officers that he, basically hangs out with at least a couple times a week. They get together, they drink scotch, they smoke cigars. And what they told him was that the police department in Kansas City had hired a bunch of black officers to replace some of the white ones that were retiring over all that's been going on right now. And also because they wanted to have more black men in their police force because, they didn't want to appear to be, too white. And he said what's happening is that the thinking, I guess, of the city leadership was they would hire all of these black cops. They would put them in the black neighborhoods. If there were any issues, it couldn't be a racial issue because it was a black cop with a black person and so forth. But that the black cops won't go to the black neighborhoods. They're refusing to work there.
For fear of their lives.
Yeah.
Well, then I'm not sure what to tell you. Maybe there is some benefit to the idea of armed people. And I hate to think they're going to end up being gangs because you never know. But listen, if we're going to support white people supporting their own property with the Second Amendment, then we need to support black people protecting their property with the Second Amendment. There is a thing about white people, I will admit, that when we see armed whites, we're not nearly as scared, right, as when we see armed blacks. So, there might be a little bit of racism there. But again, if this is how they want to solve the problems in their communities, then that needs to be listened to. What I don't like is that people don't go out and vote for their city council, right? They go out and vote for president, they might vote for senator, they might vote for their House of Rep, right? These guys do nothing. But these people in the city councils and the local level, people need to really pay attention when they're voting for these people, because I understand, right, Minneapolis, right, the city council is wielding most of the power now. Whatever they decide goes. It's a shame. I will say under Obama, they did want to push this minority recruitment effort in the police departments. And I don't know what to say about a black cop who won't go in a black neighborhood because either he's too scared or he doesn't want to police his own people. You'd think he'd be able to communicate, diffuse, go down, help out better, maybe figure out a way out of a situation than a white man who is far removed from the realities of the inner city. What happened was Obama wanted to get more cops, so he lowered the entrance qualifications. And from what the criticism was, that we had a lot of cops, that other cops and other social workers or whoever, the people that monitor the cops, said that some of these cops didn't have the reading and writing skills to understand the law. You can't have that because they were unable to read the Miranda rights properly or understand them. If you don't understand them, then obviously a suspect isn't going to understand them. And so this may continue on, in which case I don't know what you're going to end up with. Are you going to end up with guys who become cops and want to be in those neighborhoods because they can line their pockets with protection money for gangs? Or are you going to end up with all of a sudden, and by the way, this is a police brutality allegedly protest. And you've seen, for instance, in the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore a few years back, that those were majority black cops who were blamed for his death. And currently, in many cities in America, you have minority police forces, which means there's more Latinos and more blacks on the force than whites, and you have minority city leadership. You've got black mayors, black councilmen, black leaders in the city, spokesmen, activist groups, blah, blah, blah. Life has only gotten worse, evidently. If you look at the death numbers in there, the homicide rates. And by the way, the minute they get rid of cops, they'll be begging for cops before too long.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
Need to be smart, and we ask them to do too much. You can't expect a cop to be a combination diplomat, social worker, law enforcer, pat on the back, a fist fight if he's going to have to go in and fight the husband that's beaten the wife. You can't expect him to do everything. And so I do think that there's probably some room for redirecting some of the funds that go to police departments for making sure that cops go to the right calls. Do we need a cop going to a house where the neighbor is called and said they heard, I don't know, a screaming or yelling? I mean, maybe that ought to get a visit from that might not be the best example because you really don't want to play around with domestic violence, but I mean, maybe that would be a better choice than calling 911 immediately, or that 911 call gets someplace else. Or you got an obviously crazy man, right, waving a knife in the middle of a place. He's outside a building. He's going to take hostages. I don't know. Forget if he's going to do that. It probably wouldn't work. But he's obviously insane. Should we not send along with cops some mental health professional? So I think there's room for reform in here and there, and I think that we just simply ask police officers to do way too much. I mean, they got to get the cat out of the tree still, right? The kitten is stuck up there, They got to do all kinds of stuff. They got to try to diffuse situations with young teenagers fighting that doesn't do it. They even just arresting people is a difficult thing. I mean, this guy George Floyd was a big dude. When people resist arrest, it seems like if they just wouldn't resist arrest, then some of these situations wouldn't break down like this. But you got to remember, when the black community has been told day in and day out that any arrest may end in their death, they're scared. They're scared. And that is the fault of the left. That is the fault of the CNNs of the world. Matter of fact, George Floyd was probably in this. I'll take a better example. This guy, Rashard Brooks, right? The guy that grabbed the taser and started to run and for some reason turned and pointed the taser at the officer, and the officer shot him. I mean, wasn't there a better way out of that particular situation than to handle it like that? So I don't know. I think there is room for improvement, but I will say, people always say 99% of cops are good. I would say 99.9% 90% of cops are good. And sure, we've all had our experiences with them where maybe we didn't like their attitude, they didn't like our attitude, but we know that one thing we better do is not grab his weapon, fire it at him, and then start to run away. Okay, so that's just common sense, man. So, but I don't know what the black community is hearing on a daily basis. If they're being fed this from the time they're 10 years old or younger, they are brainwashed into believing that these cops are their enemies. So I don't think it's going to work out too well if we continue to lower entrance requirements for police officers. But I do believe they need a lot more help, not less.
Welcome to the Christendom Curriculum. You know, every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom Curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But we also tell the story of Christendom, the story of the Christian nations, especially as Christ's kingdom has been historically manifest in the nations of Europe and America. And we do so without apology. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom Curriculum is for you.
Click. Right, well, I definitely agree that that we probably need to at least take probably half or more of what are becoming police issues probably need to be dealt with by other professionals. We shouldn't expect police officers to be psychiatrists. We shouldn't expect in other words, there are people who would probably be able to de-escalate a situation better than somebody coming in with a gun. Somebody who's a negotiator, somebody who is a psychologist, somebody who maybe even a clergyman would be able to de-escalate a lot of situations a lot better than somebody coming in, dressed like a commando and brandishing a weapon.
Absolutely, and whoever they want. I mean, for instance, in the Brooks case, I don't know, I watched that video multiple times. I don't know if they said, no, listen, we're going to have to put you under arrest, everything's going to be fine. But listen, they went over and just put him in cuffs. And the guy, I heard him say, and I feel like that was a situation that might have been able to turn out better. The end result was dictated once he grabbed that taser. But if they'd said, okay, listen, is there anybody you want us to call? Do you want your wife down here? Whatever you got to do. If it takes an extra 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, do you want to, whatever we can do. And maybe that would have turned out a little differently. I have no clue. I just know that unqualified immunity isn't necessarily a bad thing for a cop. Okay, look, man, you think they're retiring now. Wait till you can be personally sued and your house taken if you make a mistake. That's the other thing. These cops will make mistakes. They're humans, and we can't expect them to be perfect. And they've got to be given some ability to make a mistake in their job without losing everything. So I felt like the legislation that Tim Scott put forward, the black congressman from South Carolina, was pretty good. And the Democrats want that unqualified immunity in there. That's going to chase cops out. And I don't know what's going to happen. We'll see what happens in Minneapolis. I understand crime is spiking in all these cities, right? Because the police are too scared to deal with anybody. And it's also demoralizing when you see people getting beat up and then the looter goes in, loots the place, and then you arrest him and he's out the next morning. That's just stupid. Now, at first I was a fan of maybe some bail reform, thinking this was a thing where a rich kid could get out, or middle class even, whatever, pay their bail and get out, and that was kind of an unfair situation. For poverty-stricken people who had committed the same crimes, having to sit in jail for a much longer period of time than would a rich person. But on the other hand, so many of these crimes are crimes of emotion. Oh, they get in an argument, right, and then two guys want to kill each other. Well, let that cool off, man. Maybe it's not a bad idea to have somebody in jail for 24 to 48 hours rather than get right back out on the streets when they're still fired up. So there's a lot of room for reform. There's a lot of room, but there's also not nearly enough praise going around for cops. And, at American Free Press, we had a headline recently, "Thank God for cops." Well, I do, because that's who you call when they're coming. And we would always think that, again, I'll say it again, that we could defend ourselves, but it doesn't look like that's going too well for those who do defend themselves, because the full force of the legal system is coming down on these people for protecting their own property.
Well, it's kind of a catch-22. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
It shouldn't be like that either. That's correct. That's the scary thing.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
There was an article in the July-August issue of the Barnes Review magazine. It was written by Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson. In fact, it was the first article of the issue. And in it, Dr. Johnson talks about the 1905 protests that were taking place in Russia. And, of course, you were telling me how there are some great parallels between what happened in Russia in 1905 and what the Marxists are doing today, inciting unrest, inciting protest, inciting riots, and, hoping to provoke normal people like you and I and probably most of our listeners into doing something that would basically catapult their revolution.
But what they didn't know, these protesters, was that they had been co-opted. Their leader, Father Gapon, was a police informant, and not necessarily in a good way. But within the crowd, the Marxists who had infiltrated this organization, this movement, put people with rifles and weapons, and they had also gone to neighborhood churches to ask the priests if they would give up their icons so they could carry pictures of icons and Christian leaders and pictures of the Tsar. And of course, these churches said no way. So they ransacked the churches, took pictures of the paintings of the Tsar and the martyrs and Russian saints and such. And so everybody thought this was a wonderful Christian rally, and many of the workers did as well, probably the majority. But once they came to the Winter Palace, the Tsar's troops were there, and they saw a large crowd coming, and all of a sudden these provocateurs within the crowd opened fire on the Tsar's troops, and after that it was kind of a slaughter. They probably overreacted, but whatever. They were concerned that this mob was going to ransack the Winter Palace, loot it, burn it. Okay, so one of the reasons we like this particular article is not only because it corrects the historical record as far as the bullshit propaganda, but also because it has a great pertinence to today's protests on the streets. Here you do have thousands of good people protesting peacefully, but within that crowd are provocateurs stationed there, mostly by Antifa and more radical elements of the Black Lives Matter movement, who are throwing the bottles from the back rows, hitting the cops. The cops are there in the front lines with peaceful protesters who are getting angry now too, and the cops are getting hit with bottles and caustic substances and frozen water bottles and Molotov cocktails and all this stuff, and they're getting angry. You can't expect a cop to sit out there for 12 hours and be spit upon and be screamed at face to face by people and not start to get agitated. But when the projectiles start coming from the provocateurs, then things break down. Peaceful protesters in the front line are arrested. Maybe they're beaten. Who knows? Maybe they're instigated to violence themselves because they're so angry. And then, of course, after the provocateurs have done their duty, and by the way, their duty is of these Antifa types is to instigate violence. The same thing with those stationed within the Russian workers who marched to the Tsar's palace. It was designed to end in a slaughter, which is why I always tell people, take it easy when you see the monuments come down. Yeah, it hurts pretty bad, right? But on the other hand, they're doing it to get us to do something. And we need to remember to work within legal channels and stop this, but also to have a legal law enforcement present even if it's the National Guard to protect these monuments or the Park Police or whatever.
And we are now totally out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show, but I want to thank our editor, Paul Angel, for some great insights on what's going on in our country right now.